The Wyrmwood Collective had spent 217 years perfecting the art of making other species regret evolving. They were good at it too, the way a hurricane is good at ruining beach vacations. 17 civilizations had fallen to their conquest, not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through something far more insidious, the Cascade virus. The virus was a work of biological artistry, assuming you found mass extinction artistic. It targeted neural tissue with the precision of a surgeon and the enthusiasm of a toddler with scissors. Within 72 hours of exposure, most sentient species experienced complete cognitive collapse. Their brains essentially forgot how to brain. The Wyrmwood had engineered it over millennia, tailoring it to attack the specific neural structures that every known intelligent species shared. Universal cognition markers. The xenobiologists called them death sentences. Everyone else called them. The beauty of the Cascade, from the Wyrmwood's perspective, was its efficiency. No need for prolonged ground warfare or expensive fleet deployments. Drop the virus on a few major population centers, wait a week, then waltz in and claim the real estate. The previous occupants wouldn't be filing noise complaints. They'd be lucky if they remembered how to breathe. The Galactic community had tried everything. Quarantines failed because the virus could survive in vacuum for months. Vaccines failed because the thing mutated faster than scientists could sequence it. Military resistance failed because the Wyrmwood, while primarily relying on biological warfare, still maintained a fleet capable of turning planets into abstract art, the kind nobody wanted hanging in their living room. By the time humanity stumbled onto the galactic stage, fashionably late as always, the remaining free species had essentially accepted that the Wyrmwood Collective would eventually own everything. It was just a matter of time and infection vectors. The humans arrived in ships that looked like they'd been designed by a committee that couldn't agree on anything except that more guns were probably good. Their first contact protocol involved broadcasting in 17 languages, none of which anyone in the galaxy had ever heard, followed by what appeared to be mathematical proofs, and then, inexplicably, audio recordings of whales singing. The Diplomatic Assembly of Free World, which was really more of a support group for species awaiting extinction at this point, greeted humanity with the standard welcome package, a map of safe trade routes, a list of Wyrmwood territories to avoid, and a sympathetic explanation that they'd picked a terrible time to join galactic civilization. The human delegation listened politely. They had sent a diverse group, because apparently humans couldn't agree on what their own representatives should look like. The delegation included individuals of varying melanin concentrations, gender expressions, and linguistic backgrounds. This struck the assembly as odd. Most species achieved biological uniformity within a few thousand years of developing space travel. Humans seemed to have skipped that step entirely. When the assembly finished explaining the Wyrmwood situation, the lead human diplomat, a woman with iron gray hair and the expression of someone who'd spent her career not being impressed by things, asked a simple question. So you're telling us there's a species going around committing genocide, and everyone's just letting it happen? The Assembly's senior member, a floating gaseous entity named Elder Brightness Beyond the Veil, pulsed with what might have been embarrassment. It's not that simple. The Cascade virus is unbeatable. Every species that shares the standard neural architecture is vulnerable. That's all of us. All of you, the human corrected. Yes, all of us. And all of you as well, I'm afraid. Humanity shares the same basic neural structures. Evolution tends towards similar solutions across. Has anyone checked? Elder Brightness Beyond the Veil flickered uncertainly. The biological markers are universal among sapient species. It's fundamental to consciousness itself. The human smiled, and it wasn't a comforting expression. You haven't checked, have you? You've been assuming. The science is quite clear. We'll take our chances. The assembly tried to explain, with increasing desperation, that taking chances against the Wyrmwood Collective meant extinction, that humanity should establish colonies in the remote frontier territories, keep their heads down, and maybe their species would survive on the fringes while the collective consumed the galactic core. The humans declined this generous offer. 2 weeks later, humanity declared war on the Wyrmwood Collective. The declaration itself was bizarre. It arrived via quantum encrypted transmission, written in formal diplomatic language, that somehow still managed to sound aggressive. It listed grievances against a species humanity had never actually encountered, cited violations of treaties humanity wasn't party to, and concluded with a challenge to come find out what happened. The Wyrmwood Collective received this declaration with the same emotion one might reserve for discovering ants had declared war on your kitchen. Amusement, mostly. Mild irritation at the presumption. They sent a standard response, a detailed explanation of the Cascade virus, mortality projections for the human species based on their estimated population distribution, and a polite suggestion that humanity withdraw their declaration and accept client species status. As conquering empires went, the Wyrmwood were almost cordial about it. They'd had a lot of practice. Humanity's response was shorter. No. The Wyrmwood Collective, still more amused than concerned, deployed a single vessel to the nearest human colony. They released the Cascade virus into the atmosphere of a mining settlement, housing 40,000 humans. Then they withdrew to a safe distance to observe. Standard protocol suggested waiting 72 hours for complete neural collapse. At the 72-hour mark, the humans were still mining, and complaining about the work schedules apparently, and holding what appeared to be a festival. The Wyrmwood checked their instruments. The virus had dispersed correctly. Atmospheric saturation was optimal. Infection rates should have been absolute. At the 96-hour mark, the Wyrmwood deployed scanning equipment, and confirmed that yes, the virus was present in human neural tissue. It just wasn't doing anything. Or rather it was doing something, but the humans' immune systems were treating it like a minor inconvenience, the biological equivalent of a strongly worded letter. The Wyrmwood Collective had encountered resistance before. Some species had partial immunity that delayed the inevitable. But this was different. This was humans shrugging off a virus, designed to unravel consciousness itself. The Collective deployed a fleet. Humanity deployed everything they had, which turned out to be a lot more than anyone expected. Ships poured out of Earth's system like hornets from a disturbed nest, if hornets had fusion drives and point defense systems. The war began in earnest, and the galaxy watched with horrified fascination. Not because they thought humanity could win. Nobody thought humanity could win. They watched because humans fought like they had nothing to lose, which was technically accurate, but also like they had already won, which made no sense whatsoever. The Wyrmwood Collective had conquered 17 civilizations. Humanity was about to become the 18th, or die trying, or as it turned out, something far stranger than either option. The first 6 months went exactly how everyone predicted, which is to say humanity lost nearly every major engagement, and kept acting like they were winning. It was the kind of delusional optimism that made the other species uncomfortable to watch, like seeing someone bet their life savings on a lottery ticket, and smile about it. The Wyrmwood Collective destroyed 3 human colonies, 2 orbital stations, and an entire patrol fleet in the opening weeks. Standard conquest mathematics suggested humanity should have sued for peace by month 2. Instead, humanity reinforced their positions, and started broadcasting propaganda that was equal parts defiance, and what could only be described as aggressive memory. One transmission showed a human in combat armor, standing in the ruins of a destroyed outpost, giving a thumbs up to the camera, while explosions blossomed in the background. The caption read, "Having a great time, wish you were." The Wyrmwood analysts spent 3 days trying to determine if it was a code before realizing it was just humans being humans. The thing about humanity's losses was they didn't lose efficiently. A Wyrmwood assault on a human position should have been a 3-hour operation. Instead, it turned into a 17-hour nightmare, where humans kept appearing from impossible angles, using tactics that violated several established principles of military doctrine, and occasionally just throwing things. The Battle of Outpost 47 became legendary for all the wrong reasons. The Wyrmwood deployed a ground force to secure a human research facility. They outnumbered the defenders 8-1, and had superior firepower, armor and tactical positioning. Victory was mathematically certain. 12 hours later, the Wyrmwood forces retreated, having lost 30% of their troops to an enemy that shouldn't have lasted 30 minutes. The human defenders had used conventional weapons for the first hour, then switched to improvised explosives, then to traps that suggested someone had studied predatory wildlife a bit too enthusiastically, and finally to what the Wyrmwood combat logs described as chaotic melee engagement with improvised blunt instruments. One Wyrmwood soldier's helmet camera captured a human screaming incoherently while swinging a metal pipe with the kind of commitment usually reserved for religious experiences. The footage became required viewing in Wyrmwood tactical training, not as an example of what to do, but as a warning about what happened when you assumed anything about human behavior. The Wyrmwood Collective tried deploying the Cascade virus 7 more times across different human populations. Each time, the same baffling result. Humans got mildly sick for a few days, complained extensively about headaches and fever, then went back to whatever they'd been doing. Some reported the illness improved their creativity. One human colony had a 30% spike in artistic output during their outbreak, producing sculptures and paintings that other species found either deeply moving or deeply disturbing, depending on their neural architecture. Wyrmwood xenobiologists dissected captured human specimens, trying to understand the immunity. What they found was biological chaos. Human neural tissue didn't have the elegant, uniform structure of other sapient species. It was a mess of redundancies, workarounds, and evolutionary jury-rigging that somehow produced consciousness anyway. The Cascade virus kept targeting the standard neural markers, but humans had 17 different variants of those markers, and none of them were load-bearing. Destroying one just made the others compensate. It was like trying to kill a hydra by cutting off a head, except the hydra had 1,000 heads. None of them were vital, and several weren't even properly attached but were helping anyway. The war settled into a grinding stalemate that favored nobody. Humanity couldn't match the Wyrmwood's military production, or their fleet numbers. The Wyrmwood couldn't figure out how to make humans stay dead in sufficient quantity. Every battle became a protracted nightmare, where humans refused to lose efficiently. Then humanity started adapting, because apparently surviving wasn't enough. They needed to get creative about it. Human engineers began reverse engineering Wyrmwood technology from battlefield salvage. They were terrible at it initially, producing weapons that exploded randomly, and shields that sometimes worked and sometimes just made interesting light shows. But humans had a special talent for iterative improvement. Through fail, they'd blow up a dozen prototypes, learn from each explosion, and eventually produce something that worked 60% of the time, which they considered acceptable odds. The Wyrmwood used quantum-entangled communication networks that were mathematically impossible to intercept. Humanity couldn't intercept them, so they jammed them instead, flooding the quantum channels with so much noise that the Wyrmwood had to resort to traditional radio, which humanity could intercept. It was the strategic equivalent of not being able to pick a lock, so you just break the door down instead. Human tactics evolved in directions that made military theorists physically uncomfortable. They used civilian vessels as decoys, because apparently humans hadn't developed a strong distinction between military and civilian spacecraft design philosophy. They deployed mines that were actually just spacecraft programmed to ram Wyrmwood vessels at high velocity, because guidance systems were expensive. They once evacuated an entire station by loading everyone into cargo containers and firing them toward a friendly planet, using the station's mass driver, because life support pods were in short supply but cargo containers were abundant. The Battle of the Broken Chain epitomized humanity's approach to warfare. A Wyrmwood fleet had cornered a human carrier group in a debris field with no escape routes. The humans, outgunned and outmaneuvered, did the sensible thing, and surrendered. Just kidding. They strapped explosives to asteroids and started throwing them using the carrier's tractor beams. The Wyrmwood fleet suddenly found itself dodging improvised kinetic weapons, moving at appreciable fractions of light speed. 3 Wyrmwood capital ships were destroyed by what was essentially extremely aggressive rock throwing. The battle report noted, with evident frustration, that humans had weaponized littering. But the real turning point came when humanity stopped trying to fight the war the Wyrmwood expected, and started fighting the war only humans could conceive of. A human scientist, reviewing captured Wyrmwood biological data,
noticed something interesting about the Cascade virus. It was extraordinarily specialized, tuned to attack specific neural structures, with precision. That precision was its strength, but also its limitation. The virus had been engineered for 200 years to be the perfect weapon against every known form of sapient life. Humanity wasn't known life. Humanity was the biological equivalent of a typo that somehow became functional. The scientist proposed something ridiculous. Instead of defending against the Cascade virus, humanity should study it, culture it, and modify it. Not to use as a weapon, that would be war crimes, and humanity was at least trying to maintain some ethical standards. Instead, they'd modify it to target the Wyrmwood's own neural structure. The proposal landed on the desk of Earth's military command with a note that read, "This is either brilliant or insane, possibly both." 3 months later, humanity deployed the recursion virus. It was the Cascade virus, re-engineered with human biological principles, which meant it was messy, inefficient, and absolutely refused to behave predictably. The Wyrmwood's immune systems, evolved to deal with elegant biological threats, encountered something that looked like a virus, fought like a virus, but didn't follow any of the rules viruses were supposed to follow. The recursion virus didn't kill. Humanity had decided that genocide, even in self-defense, was a line they wouldn't cross. Instead, it caused temporary neural disruption, confusion, and what Wyrmwood sufferers described as psychal, which loosely translated to thinking too many thoughts at once. Wyrmwood soldiers exposed to recursion became temporarily incapable of coordinated military action because they couldn't stop considering alternative perspectives on their orders. The Wyrmwood Collective had been confident in their inevitable victory. They'd been less confident after 6 months of grinding warfare. They became actively concerned when humanity deployed a biological weapon that made their soldiers philosophically contemplate the ethics of conquest mid-battle. For the first time in 217 years, the Wyrmwood Collective faced an enemy that fought back effectively, not through superior technology or tactics, but through sheer biological spite and creative problem-solving. The galaxy watched stunned as the unstoppable conquerors suddenly looked very stoppable indeed.
The Wyrmwood Collective's high command gathered in their neural adits conference chamber, which was less a room and more a shared consciousness space where thoughts manifested as geometric patterns. Currently, those patterns looked like a migraine having an existential crisis. They had devoted 17 cycles to analyzing the human problem, and the analysis kept returning the same conclusion. This shouldn't be happening. Humanity's immunity to the Cascade virus wasn't just unexpected, it was statistically offensive. The virus had been designed using fundamental principles of neurobiology that applied to every sapient species ever documented. The Wyrmwood had genetic samples from 43 different intelligent species across the galaxy, and all of them shared the critical neural architecture that made the Cascade lethal. Humans shared approximately 70% of those markers. They should have been vulnerable. Instead, they'd somehow evolved brains that worked like a committee, where every member had veto power and nobody could agree on what dying was supposed to look like. The lead Wyrmwood xenobiologist presented her findings to the High Command, and her thought patterns radiated deep professional frustration. Human brains were evolutionary disasters that happened to produce consciousness anyway. They had redundant neural pathways that served no obvious purpose. They had brain regions that didn't specialize properly. Some humans had left hemisphere dominance, others right hemisphere dominance, and some seemed to have decided that hemispheric dominance was optional. One human specimen they'd studied had suffered massive neural trauma that should have resulted in complete cognitive loss. Instead, the human's brain had just rerouted everything through different pathways, took 6 months to rewire itself, and the individual returned to functional status, complaining only about persistent headaches and a newfound inability to remember names. The human had compensated by nicknaming everyone, which somehow worked as a social strategy. This was the species the Wyrmwood were fighting. Beings whose brains could suffer catastrophic damage and respond by improvising new neural architecture on the fly. The recursion virus deployment had been bad enough. Watching their soldiers become temporarily pacifistic philosophers in the middle of combat operations was humiliating. But the real problem emerged when Wyrmwood intelligence analyzed human medical data they'd captured from a destroyed research station. Humans weren't just immune to the Cascade virus. They were using it. The research data showed human scientists had isolated the virus, sequenced it completely, and then started experimenting with it the way a chef experiments with spices. They'd created 17 variants, each targeting different neural structures. Most were failures that did nothing or caused minor headaches. 3 were promising. 1 was now being weaponized. But the data also revealed something the humans themselves apparently found hilarious. The Cascade virus, when introduced to human neural tissue in controlled doses, sometimes produced beneficial effects. A small percentage of exposed humans showed enhanced cognitive flexibility, improved pattern recognition, and increased creative problem-solving abilities. The virus designed to destroy consciousness was making some humans smart. The Wyrmwood High Command's thought patterns collapsed into what could only be described as the geometric equivalent of screaming. One human research note included in the captured data read, Subject 47 reports the virus makes her head feel fizzy, but she solved a quantum mechanics problem she'd been stuck on for 2 years. So we're calling it a WA. The note was signed with a small doodle of a smiling face, because humans apparently couldn't submit scientific documentation without adding frivolous artwork. The Wyrmwood were fighting a species that could take their ultimate weapon, shrug it off, weaponize it back at them and accidentally get smarter in the process. It was like punching someone and having them thank you for the chiropractic adjustment. Meanwhile, humanity's military strategy had evolved from desperate survival to aggressive experimentation. They'd discovered that Wyrmwood technology relied heavily on biological computing systems that used neural tissue as processing substrate. Very efficient, very elegant, very vulnerable to anything that disrupted neural function. Human engineers started developing weapons that targeted biological computers specifically, not with the recursion virus, that was saved for battlefield deployment against soldiers. These were electromagnetic pulse devices, tuned to frequencies that made organic neural tissue very unhappy. The weapons didn't kill, but they did make Wyrmwood ships suddenly forget how to maintain orbit, or target weapons or keep life support running. The Battle of the Helix Nebula showcased humanity's new approach. A Wyrmwood battle group, 200 vessels strong, engaged a human fleet of 70 ships. The Wyrmwood had overwhelming numerical superiority and better weapons. They should have annihilated the human force. The human fleet deployed neural disruptors and the Wyrmwood formation fell apart as their ship's biological computers began experiencing what the after-action report described as aggressive confusion. Wyrmwood vessels started targeting each other, not because they'd been hacked, but because their targeting computers couldn't reliably distinguish between friend and foe anymore. The humans won by making the enemy too confused to fight, which was technically a valid military strategy, but felt deeply unfair to everyone involved. The Wyrmwood Collective, for the first time in their civilization's history, convened an emergency session to discuss potential peace negotiations. Not because they'd been defeated, they still had superior numbers and resources, but because continuing the war meant fighting an enemy that turned every Wyrmwood advantage into a liability. The Cascade virus, humans were immune and had weaponized it back. Biological compute, vulnerable to human electronic warfare. Superior numbers, irrelevant when human tactics made coordination impossible. The cold mathematics of the situation were unambiguous. The Wyrmwood could probably still win through sheer attrition, but the cost would be catastrophic. They'd lose half their fleet, a significant portion of their population, and their reputation as unstoppable conquerors would be shattered. All to defeat a species that had been spacefaring for less than 2 centuries, and still hadn't figured out standardized ship design. The truly maddening part was that humanity hadn't won through superior technology or tactics. They'd won by being biologically ridiculous and tactically unpredictable. They'd taken every disadvantage and turned it into an asset through the simple expedient of refusing to lose the way they were supposed to. One Wyrmwood analyst submitted a report that concluded, humanity's primary military advantage is that they are bad at things in ways we cannot anticipate or counter. Another report noted, human military doctrine appears to be try everything, learn from failures, repeat until something works. This is technically a valid approach, but shouldn't be this effective. A third report simply read, we should have checked if they were actually vulnerable to the Cascade virus before declaring conquest intentions. Recommend this procedure for future expansion. The diplomatic assembly of free worlds watched the war's progression with emotions ranging from relief to absolute bewilderment. Humanity had done what 17 civilizations couldn't, made the Wyrmwood Collective reconsider their expansion plan. Elder Brightness Beyond the Veil contacted the human diplomatic mission with a message that took 3 attempts to phrase correctly. We apologize for doubting your chances. We have several questions about your biology that seem urgent given current events. The human diplomat who declared war 9 months ago responded with a message that read, "Told you so. Also, we're going to need help with the peace negotiations, because we're honestly not sure what we're doing here." The galaxy braced itself for whatever came next, because if humanity's war had been this chaotic, their peace was likely to be equally unpredictable. The peace negotiations took place on a neutral station that had been hastily constructed for the occasion, mostly because nobody trusted either side not to weaponize the meeting location. The station's designers had included 17 redundant safety systems, diplomatic immunity protocols, and a structural layout that prevented anyone from being trapped in a room with anyone else for more than 30 minutes. They'd learned from history that peace talks could be more dangerous than actual warfare. The Wyrmwood delegation arrived in ceremonial neural interface suits that broadcast their thoughts as color patterns, a traditional display of openness and honesty. The human delegation arrived in formal attire that looked suspiciously like modified military uniforms, and several members were visibly armed, which violated 6 different diplomatic protocols but the humans claimed was ceremonial. Nobody believed this, but nobody wanted to start the negotiations by arguing about weapon definitions. The opening statements took 4 hours because both sides kept trying to establish that they hadn't actually lost. The Wyrmwood insisted they remained militarily superior, and were negotiating from a position of strength. Humanity insisted they'd won every engagement that mattered, and were being gracious about the peace terms. Neither statement was entirely true, both were strategically necessary, and everyone in the room knew it. The actual negotiations were surprisingly straightforward once both sides stopped posturing. The Wyrmwood would cease all hostile actions against humanity and formally recognize human territorial claims. Humanity would cease deploying neural disruptors and the recursion virus. Both sides would establish a demilitarized zone that was really just empty space. Neither side wanted anyway, and trade agreements would be established once everyone stopped being nervous about shipping containers that might contain improvised weapons. The complicated part was what came next. The diplomatic assembly of free worlds had been watching humanity's war with the kind of desperate hope usually reserved for terminal patients, considering experimental treatments. If humanity could resist the Cascade virus, maybe they could help other species develop resistance. Maybe the Wyrmwood's reign of terror was finally over. The human diplomatic corps found themselves fielding requests from 14 different species, all asking variations of the same question: could humanity share their immunity? The answer was complicated in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. Human immunity to the Cascade virus wasn't a simple genetic marker that could be transferred. It was the result of millions of years of chaotic evolution that produced brains capable of working despite being biological disasters. Human neural architecture was redundant, inefficient, and contradictory. It worked, but calling it elegant would be generous. One human neuroscientist explained it to the assembly using an analogy. Imagine a machine designed by 17 different engineers who never talked to each other, built using spare parts from unrelated projects, held together with improvised fasteners, and somehow it still functioned. That's a human brain. You can't just copy that. You'd need to recreate the entire evolutionary disaster that produced it. The assembly's reaction ranged from disappointment to philosophical horror at the implications. But humanity being humanity proposed an alternative. If other species couldn't develop immunity, maybe humans could serve as a buffer, a biological firewall against Wyrmwood expansion. Not through military action. That war had been expensive enough, but through simple presence. The idea was elegantly simple and completely insane, which made it perfectly human. Human settlements would be established in border regions between Wyrmwood space and free space. These settlements would be civilian, technically, but everyone understood they served a strategic purpose. The Wyrmwood couldn't deploy the Cascade virus anywhere humans lived because it simply didn't work, and invading human settlements conventionally was, as the Wyrmwood had discovered, more trouble than it was worth. Humanity would become the galaxy's immune system, the one species the Wyrmwood couldn't easily eliminate.
The proposal was accepted with a mixture of relief and unease. Other species were grateful for the protection, but deeply uncomfortable with the implication. They'd spent millennia developing elegant solutions to biological and technological challenges. Humanity had stumbled into the galaxy, survived through biological chaos and tactical improvisation, and now occupied a unique position in galactic affairs, by virtue of being evolutionarily confused. The human settlements in the border regions became strange places, where galactic cultures collided with human unpredictability. Wyrmwood traders learned to deal with humans who negotiated prices, with the kind of aggressive cheerfulness usually reserved for competitive sport. Other species established research stations near human colonies to study how humanity managed to function with such inefficient biology. One research team spent 3 years documenting human decision-making processes, and concluded that humans used a combination of rational analysis, emotional intuition, social consideration, and random guessing weighted by recent experiences. The lead researcher's final report included the note, "This shouldn't work. I'm professionally offended that it does work." The Wyrmwood Collective, for their part, adjusted to the new reality with varying degrees of success. Their expansion plans now included the notation "Avoid human territories," in the same way navigation charts noted hazardous phenomena like black holes or stellar radiation. Some younger Wyrmwood developed a fascination with human culture, studying the species that had stopped their civilization's expansion through sheer biological obstinacy. Human cultural exports became unexpectedly popular in Wyrmwood space. Human music, with its chaotic structures and emotional intensity, found an audience among Wyrmwood youth, who found their own culture's mathematical precision sterile. Human literature, full of protagonists who succeeded through improvisation and failure, resonated with individuals tired of their society's emphasis on calculated perfection. The Wyrmwood High Command watched this cultural infiltration with concern but couldn't figure out how to stop it without appearing authoritarian, and their society valued individual choice too highly to enforce complete cultural isolation. They'd been defeated militarily by human unpredictability, and now faced a slower infiltration through cultural appeal. It was, several analysts noted, possibly worse than losing the war. 3 years after the peace treaty, the galaxy had settled into a new equilibrium. The Wyrmwood Collective remained powerful but no longer unstoppable. Humanity occupied a strange position, as both newcomers to galactic civilization, and the species that had changed the balance of power. Other species viewed humans with mixtures of gratitude, confusion and concern about what they'd do next. The Diplomatic Assembly of Free Worlds held its annual gathering, and Elder Brightness Beyond the Veil addressed the assembly with thoughts that flickered between satisfaction and bewilderment. The existential threat they'd lived under for centuries was diminished, not through grand military coalitions or technological breakthroughs, but because one species had arrived late to galactic civilization, and was too biologically confused to die properly. The human delegation attended, still wearing what looked like military uniforms, despite repeated requests for more traditional diplomatic attire. When asked about humanity's plans for the future, their response was characteristically unhelpful. "We're figuring it out as we go." This inspired no confidence in anyone, but it was probably honest. A Wyrmwood observer delegation attended the assembly for the first time in their civilization's history, present not as conquerors but as participants in galactic governance. Their spokesperson, speaking through translated thought patterns, acknowledged that the war with humanity had taught them uncomfortable lessons about assumptions and certainty. Nobody mentioned that those lessons had cost both sides substantial casualties and resources. Everyone was trying to move forward, even if nobody was entirely sure what forward looked like anymore. The assembly concluded with traditional ceremonies, celebrating galactic unity and cooperation. Then everyone retreated to private channels to discuss the human problem, because having humans as allies was wonderful, but also meant dealing with a species that solved problems by hitting them repeatedly until something worked. On Earth, military strategists compiled after-action reports on the Wyrmwood conflict. The conclusions were sobering. Humanity had survived through a combination of biological accident, tactical improvisation, and sheer stubborn refusal to lose. They'd won a war they shouldn't have survived by not fighting it, the way anyone expected. One report noted, "Our primary advantage was that we didn't know we couldn't win. Recommend maintaining this approach for future conflicts." Another concluded, "The Cascade virus immunity was luck. The tactical victories were competence. The peace was necessity. We should probably develop actual strategies, instead of making it up as we go." A third report, written by the same diplomat who'd declared war, simply read, "We fought a war we couldn't win. We survived anyway." This is apparently what humanity does. Recommend we get better at it, because next time we might not be lucky. The galaxy had changed. The unstoppable conquerors had been stopped. The impossible war had ended in a peace nobody had anticipated. And humanity, late to galactic civilization, and still figuring out basic diplomatic protocols, had become the species that made genocide impractical. It wasn't the victory anyone had imagined. It wasn't even clear it was a victory at all. But it was survival, which had always been humanity's specialty. The Wyrmwood Collective had spent 217 years perfecting the art of making other species regret evolving. They'd finally met a species that regretted nothing, learned from everything, and refused to die correctly. The galaxy would never be the same, which was either promising or terrifying depending on your perspective, and how much you trusted humans to not accidentally break something important. Somewhere in the border territories, a human settlement celebrated 3 years of successful coexistence with Wyrmwood neighbors by hosting a cultural festival that confused everyone involved. There was music, food, competitive games, and what appeared to be interpretive dance, but might have been malfunctioning gravity generators. Nobody was entirely sure. The Wyrmwood attendees tried to understand the appeal and failed, but attended anyway, because isolation seemed worse than confusion. The galaxy continued turning, stars continued burning, and humanity continued being humanity, which was apparently enough to change everything.